we were approached by some terrific folks at the Waverly Community House because they've got a terrific program about the Underground Railroad and the movement of enslaved people through Waverly, and guess what? Through Montrose, and through a great deal of the rest of Susquehanna County. And they suggested that we have a partnership, and they have offered to come and talk to you about those situations. So, without much further ado, I'm going to introduce E.J. Murphy. He is the program coordinator for the Waverly Community House. And thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. Appreciate it. Hi, everyone.
Morning.
How are we doing today? I had my whole thing with notes. I was going to use that, but I figured this is going to be a little more informal. So we'll just kind of talk. If you have any questions as I'm going along, anything you want to add, anything like that, please feel free to interrupt me, because if you don't, I will not shut up. Okay. I am the program manager of the Destination Freedom Underground Railroad Walking Tour at the Waverly Community House. This program was actually started by Gia Tugin, who is sitting in the back row. Probably doesn't want me to point her out, but I am going to anyway. She is our interim director at the Waverly Community House. She started this program in 2017, and since then we've seen a lot of growth. It's one of the reasons why we're able to do things like come out to the Susquehanna County Historical Society and talk about not just our program, but the history that our program likes to highlight. In March of 2022, we were added to the National Park Service's National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom program. So through that, we are a National Park Service affiliate. If you are aware of the Park Service system, they have the Passport Stamp program, where you can go and collect stamps throughout your journeys to Park Service sites. We are a Passport Stamp stop. So if you have a passport, feel free to come on by. I do want to get started here, though, because we do have a lot to talk about. Now, I'm assuming, how many of us are from Montrose, or at least the immediate area from around here? Okay, so good chunk of us. Outside the area?
Forest.
Okay, so it's still relative. So I'm kind of thinking northeastern Pennsylvania. Today, I am going to talk about Waverly and Montrose. I'm also going to talk about some other towns that we're going to tie in, just to kind of tell the story of this area, not just one town or one place, but how these different places were connected, and the very interesting and complicated stories that these places that you wouldn't typically associate with this type of history. When I think we talk Black history, I don't think Waverly or Montrose or Towanda, Pennsylvania are some of the first places that come to mind. However, these towns are some of the integral parts of this story. The story is not a new one. The knowledge of the Underground Railroad in this area has been studied for a very, very long time. This is a map from Wilbur Seibert's 1898 study of the Underground Railroad. So this, again, is not something that we just discovered recently. It's just a new way for us to bring it to the public through our program. This is a more modern map from the Underground Railroad in Pennsylvania by William Swetala. He does a great job of putting together maps and such of the different routes that were being used. So this is the general area that I'm going to be talking about today, again, with a focus on Waverly and Montrose, but we're also going to pull in places like Towanda and Wilkes-Barre to the south of us. So again, this is just to kind of orient you as to what we're going to be, the area we're going to be discussing today. Again, Waverly is kind of like an important little jump-off point. You can see here it connects to a couple different points going farther north. So we were kind of like the central hub of this little wheel that kind of was the Underground Railroad. So we are very part to play a part in that, and also to connect to very important places like Montrose, which, very similar to Waverly, is a part of this system. Over time, builds up a large Black community as a result of the Underground Railroad in the area. Montrose was actually a much bigger town than Waverly at the time. So there was actually there was a little bit more abolitionist sentiment, a little bit more active activism, a larger Black community than what you saw in Waverly. So it's very similar stories. Almost Montrose is like a little bit bigger in scale almost. Now, in order to tell this story properly, you kind of have to start with the formation of the United States government under the U.S. Constitution. There were a couple basic protections of slavery that were written into the Constitution. I'm just going to focus on the one that is at the center of our story, and that is the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution, Article 4, Section 2. That was the part of the Constitution that mandated that you had to return an escaped enslaved person to their enslaver if they had escaped and made their way even to somewhere that might have outlawed slavery. Which northern states were doing over time since the conception of the U.S. Constitution. So this is where that map kind of comes into play, why that map exists, why these towns are connected, and why we're telling this story here is because of a constitutional mandate. So it's an important reference to think about the idea that not only were the people who were involved in this system, both the formerly enslaved and the abolitionists who played a part in it, this was not just a moral stand, a moral issue that they were facing, this was also a legal one. So you were risking quite a lot if you were actively participating in this system. So again, that just kind of lays the foundation for why this is even an issue right now. And again, just to give some context, Susquehanna County, not too long after the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, Susquehanna County is going to be formed. And you're going to start to see the arrival of African Americans as early as the late 1700s. Some of you may have heard the name Prince Perkins before, if you're from the area. He was one of the first formerly enslaved residents who were going to settle here and start to build a life in this area. So again, this is kind of the foundation, right? Now, over time, the slavery issue, particularly in places like Montrose, where you had a large growing abolitionist sentiment, the slavery issue is going to get a little bit fiery over time. Some of you may be familiar with Isaac Post, one of the first early settlers to Montrose in the Montrose area. He's buried right up in Montrose Cemetery. The Post family is kind of going to be the root of the kind of abolitionist movement here in Montrose. And again, as early as 1837, you see him kind of preaching anti-slavery thought. The merchandise of human flesh that is now practiced in the United States is a sin. It ought to be abolished, and it is the duty and privilege of every Christian and church to bear testimony against slavery publicly and privately. Now, this is, especially at the time, this is pretty radical. Okay, the abolitionist movement hasn't really picked up steam in the North yet. So this is kind of a precursor of some of the rhetoric you're going to hear over time as this issue becomes even bigger and more important. Isaac Post had a son, A.L. Post, who is also buried in Montrose Cemetery. He was a preacher here in Montrose. And he is also going to officially align with anti-slavery societies in the North. He actually becomes a pretty prominent member in some of these national organizations. This is not just an anti-slavery society that gets formed like here in Montrose. He's going to places farther north, and he's speaking among some of the biggest names in the anti-slavery movement. These are just a couple articles I found that highlight A.L. Post and his involvement in this. Again, the writing is very small. If you ever read these old newspapers, you know how annoying it can be. But both of these are for anti-slavery meetings that were held that A.L. Post actually attended. And like I said, he's going to brush shoulders with some pretty important figures, including people like Frederick Douglass. There was a meeting in Petersburg, New York. Okay, this is again kind of one of the hubs of the anti-slavery movement in New York State. And you can see here, Reverend A.L. Post of Montrose was one of the officers of this convention, where Frederick Douglass actually addressed the crowd. Now, do we know if they actually had an did they know each other? Did they meet? Were they friends? I haven't seen anything like that, but you know that they were floating in certain circles. So the odds of them meeting and probably talking to each other, I would say, pretty good. And again, this is where you're going to start to see this kind of build up over time. Other individuals are going to get involved in this anti-slavery movement. One of the other most important names in terms of abolitionists is going to be Judge William Jessup, who, if you're from around here, it's a hard name to miss. He's also buried up in Montrose Cemetery, and he's going to be one of the leading kind of political activists when it comes to the anti-slavery movement. I'm going to talk a little bit more about him later, but this is really interesting. This is from an 1830s newspaper that I found, where they were talking about this area sending a representative to D.C. and how inevitably, because of the candidates, it was going to be an abolitionist candidate. You guys know who this is, right? Francis Scott Key, National Anthem, Star Spangled Banner, all that. Well, a lot of people don't know about him is he was pretty active in legally persecuting abolitionists. Okay, this Dr. Crandall here was an anti-slavery advocate who Key actually sued. All right, because he was publishing abolitionist papers that he said was instigating slave uprisings. Okay, and Francis Scott Key actually sued this guy to try to take him to court. It doesn't happen, but one of the things they ask in this article is, well, what if one of these guys shows up? Or is he going to try to take them to court too, or put them in prison? So now you see this issue is really becoming serious. Again, speaking of Judge William Jessup, there he is, and there's his headstone in Montrose Cemetery. Also buried in Montrose Cemetery is Gabriel Chappelle, excuse me, who was a former slave who was actually employed by the Jessup family. Okay, and so the family here, you see, born in slavery, died in June 1906. 40 years a faithful servant of the family of those who erected this monument. Okay, so this is a person who was, again, closely tied to the Jessup family, who was a formerly enslaved person. So again, you can kind of see maybe where this, this political sentiment is coming from. Okay, it's not just a grand idea, it's, you're pretty close to the issue, okay, here in Montrose. Which again is something that people don't think about when you think about the anti-slavery movement, when you think about the Civil War era. I don't think Montrose and Waverly towns, those don't usually come to mind. Over time, the anti-slavery movement is going to grow. The Montrose Spectator was a paper run by A.L. Post, and this is going to be one of the leading anti-slavery papers in the area early on. This is from a Wilkes-Barre paper that the Montrose Spectator reached out to try to advertise for an anti-slavery meeting at the Presbyterian Church here in Montrose. You'll notice in this article, if the publishers of the Spectator will guarantee us the usual compensation for such services, we will give the advertisement publicity with pleasure. We will inform the editor, the Spectator editors, and all others, however, for once and for all, that we cannot and will not insert grant us anything calculated to aid the diabolical schemes and incendiary projects of the abolitionists. So essentially, if you pay us, yeah, we'll put this ad in your paper, but we're not endorsing it by any means.
Okay, quick question.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm going back one slide.
Sure.
But what I thought was interesting, it says, to the family of those who erected this monument, no listing of the family names.
Yeah, they didn't add, they didn't say who the family was.
Yeah.
Maybe hoping over time that association maybe isn't there.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Again, I can't get in the head of Judge William Jessup, but maybe if we
I'll
get some
just add
insight.
one comment on Gabriel Chappell. He was born in slavery in Alabama, or South Carolina. He became a slave of General John Gordon, who was a Confederate officer, and he accompanied Gordon's wife all through the Civil War. I accidentally picked up a book by General Gordon that used to belong to the Historical Society here, and read through it trying to find out when he got his freedom. And the only thing I could figure out is that Winchester, Virginia was an embattled area in several different times, and the only thing I could figure is that the last time that the family was in Winchester, he decided he was no longer going to be the carriage driver for Mrs. Gordon, and he is not mentioned again. He was never mentioned by name in the book, but it's the only way I could figure that that's how he got.
And that wouldn't be an uncommon story. There are actually a couple post-war residents of Scranton who were former slaves who actually somehow, again, studying the Underground Railroad, especially former slaves who somehow made their way to like Union lines during the war. Very difficult to kind of track that information. So there were a couple post-war residents of Scranton who kind of had a similar story where they somehow, some way during the Army ended up with the Union Army, and eventually somehow made their way north. And again, that's what can be putting together these stories a little bit difficult. So that's why you gotta rely on what you can find, and whether that's a headstone or an old newspaper clip or some documents that you find in an archive, it could be a difficult thing to try to piece together. But yeah, it's very interesting.
That newspaper article, it's interesting because they're saying that there's going to be this convention, and it's a terrible thing, but they are actually advertising it.
They're still advertising it, yeah, they're still getting their name of that. But they want to make sure that everyone knows that the paper themselves are not actually endorsing this anti-slavery meeting.
But they are running the ad.
But they are running the ad.
So, and again, I'm basing this on the movie Harriet, which I loved. Wasn't there a time where the state of Pennsylvania did allow people of color to live freely, no expectations, but then there was a bill that was passed in Congress later on?
So what happens in Pennsylvania is, early on, there's a voting rights case at the center of the story that we tell at the Waverly Community House. Early on, black men had basically full civil rights. You could own property as long as you paid taxes, you could vote. The big issue that comes across in the 1830s is voting rights. It comes up because this guy named William Fogg, who's from Scott Township, or lived in Scott Township in the late 1830s, goes up to vote, he gets denied at the polls, he goes to court locally, then he goes to the state Supreme Court. Then our state decides that we're going to look at the state constitution to insert the word white to make it known that it is white men who have the right to vote. So you see the stripping of civil rights over time. I don't know if that's what you're
But
referencing.
did that lead to the flee from, I mean, how many people came to Pennsylvania knowing that they were free, could own property, could vote and everything else? And then when that changed, they started going up into Canada?
So you start to see the movement up to Canada more in like the 1850s when you see the passage of a new fugitive slave law that kind of gives a little more teeth to the constitutional mandate that I talked about earlier.
Okay.
I'm actually going to get to that in a second. I'm glad you brought that up. But that's when you start to see the major flee north, especially to Canada, because once you cross that line into Canada, all of a sudden the legalities, you don't have to quite worry as much. And Canada was a British province at the time. Great Britain had abolished slavery decades before the United States does, so they didn't have much reason to cooperate with the United States government in terms of returning fugitive slaves. So yeah, it's a whole complicated, like I said, it's a whole complicated thing. So I'm going to try to uncomplicate it here a little bit for you. There are big issues that the Montrose Spectator, specifically, this is a reprinted article from the Spectator, that's acknowledging the gag rule that was passed by Congress. This was in the 1830s and it lasted into the 1840s. This was a law passed by Congress that said that you were not even allowed to talk about the issue of slavery in Congress. If you were a Northern congressman or senator and you wanted to bring up anti-slavery legislation, you could not do it. And the Montrose Spectator, again, this is a longer article, but essentially what they're saying is it's either we put up with this or we have to basically be embarrassed. There's conflict that's really brewing here, and this gag rule did a lot to kind of divide Northerners and Southerners in terms of this issue of slavery and then how people were dealing with it, right? Again, you couldn't even bring up a piece of legislation or talk about it in Congress because of this gag rule. Again, this is just a political cartoon. Abolition frowned down. You can see abolitionists here kind of getting scolded by a slaveholder. So this is a big issue, and again, it was not lost on people who lived here in Montrose. Same thing, again, longer article here, but this is an article talking about the murder of Elijah Lovejoy in the 1830s. This was an anti-slavery and abolitionist newspaper editor who was killed by a pro-slavery mob. He has a brother who's going to be a congressman later on, one of the leading anti-slavery abolitionists in Congress, and his brother's going to be going to move along a lot of bills. But this, again, to give you just, if you read the title here, it gives you an idea of the kind of the sentiment of this article. Nothing new under the sun, saying this kind of violence is what we can expect from slaveholders whose moral compass is this skewed. They have no, compunction when it comes to violence and using that violence to further their goals. So this murder, again, was another kind of fuel to the fire on the division between North and South. And again, this is reprinted. This is a reprinted Montrose Spectator article. So this is coming right from here. Now in the 1840s, another issue pops up. We got a whole lot of land out west from Mexico. What's going to happen with that? Okay, northeastern Pennsylvania is going to initiate the discussion about this new land, and that's a guy named David Wilmot. David Wilmot was born in Bethany. Okay, Bethany, Pennsylvania, so not too far from here, right outside of Honesdale. And he's going to eventually make his way to Towanda, that's where he makes his name. He becomes a lawyer, he becomes ingrained in politics in the area. And again, Towanda is another Underground Railroad town. So he's kind of directly seeing some of the, what's going on in the national scope of things. Now in Congress, towards the end of the Mexican-American War, they are debating an appropriations bill for money, what to be used on for this new land. And Wilmot tries to slide in, and a couple other people in his party try to slide in a provision that says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall ever exist in any part of said territory. So this is kind of one of the first big national, hey, we're going to do something about this institution of slavery. Now, Wilmot's complicated. At the time, even in Congress, he does speak to the notion that he's kind of arguing this, not necessarily because he's anti-slavery and sympathetic towards black people, but it's more so we want this land out west to be opened up for white farmers and white people to be able to grow and prosper. So even something like this anti-slavery act, does have a little bit of complications to it. Now over time, Wilmot, his views are going to evolve. He actually does become a very ardent anti-slavery advocate, especially when Lincoln becomes elected. But this is kind of where the growth of his kind of change starts to begin a little bit. And over time, he gets very frustrated with the slave power, the political aspect of the pro-slavery kind of mechanism. Frederick Douglass picks up on the Wilmot Proviso. He hears about this provision that Wilmot tries to slide in, and he kind of shows, even though everyone else is getting super riled up about it in the country because it's now showing that Northerners are willing to take political action against the institution of slavery, he says that we regard it as a step in the right direction and hail it as the most hopeful sign of the times, but it is but a sign. So, we're moving in the right direction, but we're not quite there yet. One of the things that's very interesting from a public historian standpoint, I do like the fact that if you go to Towanda or Bethany, you have David Wilmot's birth home still stands in Bethany, and he has two homes, this one right here and this one, where he lived in during the wartime, that both still stand in town. He's also buried in Towanda, and on his headstone, his provision was etched into the headstone there. So again, just from a public history standpoint, this is really cool for me to be able to go walk around and find out. Now, these issues are going to keep boiling up, and this fugitive slave issue really becomes, again, one of the centers of the story. This is from a local newspaper that talked about a meeting here in Montrose, held to express the indignation of the citizens against a body of armed men who have been concealed in the town for the purpose of kidnapping a number of colored persons, formerly slaves, who for several years have resided there, leading quiet, industrious, and honest lives. So again, it's this idea that we have these people coming here. They are trying to capture people who have been living here, contributing members of society, and they are not having it. All right, the citizens are, or at least a section of the citizens of Montrose. One of the things that we do highlight on our program, even in small towns like Waverly, people were very divided on these issues. Just because Montrose and Waverly existed as Underground Railroad towns does not mean that there were people who were maybe not so sympathetic who lived in these places. The fugitive slave issue kind of builds up over time. In 1850, there's a new fugitive slave law that is passed. This fugitive slave law basically mandates all Northerners to have to actively participate in the catching and returning of fugitive slaves. This becomes a lightning rod because Northerners, one, are sick of being pushed around by pro-slavery political sentiment that's making them do things or act in ways that they might not want to. And local communities are going to respond. Judge William Jessup here got a letter from John Raymond, Waverly abolitionist, basically asking, this is written just a couple weeks after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, and this Waverly abolitionist is going to be basically asking Jessup, we need organized political resistance to this. We cannot let this stand. That's the kind of sentiments of the letter here. This letter is actually in the collection here at the Susquehanna County Historical Society. Again, you're going to see organized political resistance, not just from abolitionists, right? You're also going to see local black communities stand up and say, we will not have this. Towanda, Pennsylvania, as I said before, you don't typically think of Towanda when you think of black history, but in 1850, the black residents of Towanda are going to meet in opposition to the Fugitive Slave Law, and this is how strongly they felt about this. That before we will submit to be dragged into southern bondage by the man-stealers of the South, we will die in the defense of our right to liberty. So now this is no longer just a political thing. No longer just a political thing. Now it's becoming a personal and a violent thing. Okay, you're starting to see actual violence being threatened. All right, a couple politicians who are going to be, again, kind of part of this anti-slavery movement here in the area. You have Galusha Grow. Galusha Grow was born in Connecticut, someone who, like many of the residents who are going to settle in places like Montrose and Waverly early on, from New England. So bringing a lot of that anti-slavery sentiment from that area to this area. He's going to serve in the House of Representatives. David Wilmot is going to serve just before him, so Wilmot's going to kind of pass the torch to this guy in terms of this political anti-slavery movement. Speaker of the House, 1861 to 1863, and father of the Homestead Act, an act that allowed for settlers to move out west on territory paid for by the federal government. As I know you guys, there's a walking tour that's part of this program today, so I don't want to spoil anything, but this is Galusha Grow's final resting place in Hartford. This is something that you might have seen before. I'm going to skip that because you might be going, you might go and see that. Now, I bring up Galusha Grow for a reason. While he's in Congress, he's there during this big movement where there is actual violence in Congress. The most famous example is Charles Sumner being beaten by Preston Brooks of South Carolina with a cane. So much so that Charles Sumner, again, anti-slavery advocate, okay, he actually can't go back and serve in Congress for months and months and months and months because he was so severely beaten. Again, you see a divide. Southerners, a lot of Southerners are reacting positively to this. They're sending him canes, saying do it again, use beat down arguments, things like that. And then Northerners are looking at this and saying, you guys are sick. You are cheering this guy on who just beat almost to death a sitting member of the United States Congress. Galusha Grow is going to be part of this violence. He gets in a fight with Heat, who's going to be a Confederate general during the war. He gets in a scrum when Galusha Grow at one point gets up to go to the Democratic side of the hall to talk to someone. Heat says something along the lines of, go sit down, you black Republican puppy. Black Republican was a term used to insult anti-slavery members of the Republican Party. And he said something, and Galusha responds by saying something along the lines of, you're not going to drive me like you drive your slaves, or something along those lines. Then they start fighting. Now, in the account of this fight, it was kind of like it was more of a scrum, it wasn't really a fight. And it ends when another Southern congressman comes in and knocks this guy's wig off his head, and everybody starts laughing. Okay? So again, violent, but it's an interesting story. Galusha Grow, again, is at the center of it. You can see here. Right? So yeah, so things are interesting in our politics at this point in time. Here in Montrose, they're starting to look towards the future. Okay, if we're going to advocate anti-slavery, if we're going to do things like that, we need to have a plan for the future. So in 1858, so just 2 years before Abraham Lincoln's going to get elected as president, these citizens of Montrose, white citizens of Montrose, are going to meet to talk about how do you properly integrate either formerly enslaved or freeborn African Americans fully into society. The big theme of the day is education. Okay, and that's going to be a big theme all throughout, not just the war, but in the post-war years and Reconstruction. How do you elevate someone from a position of being either a former slave or considered a caste, right, in our society? How do you move from that to being productive members? And that was, again, the theme of this meeting. You can see, again, William Jessup was there, a lot of the movers and shakers in the area. So again, this is the sentiment that's building up over time. And this was actually published in the Liberator. If you guys are familiar with William Lloyd Garrison and his anti-slavery movement, very associated with Frederick Douglass early on. This is printed in his newspaper out of Boston. We have some newspapers here that I want to highlight. During the war, especially in the years leading up to the war, there's going to be two papers that are going to be showing kind of both sides. On the Republican side, you have the Independent Republican, and you can see kind of what they believed in: freedom and right against slavery and wrong. So when you think about the partisan times that they were in, you can imagine what side that they were on. A.J. Trager is going to be the editor of this, and I thought I had a picture of him somewhere, but I guess not. The other paper, the opposite side of this, is going to be the Montrose Democrat, and that is going to be edited by A.J. Garrison, who is also going to be kind of a major player in local politics, things like that. This is a Democratic paper, so you're talking kind of the opposite of the Lincoln administration, kind of things like that. And we're going to see a lot of clippings in the rest of this presentation that are going to come from both of these papers, so I wanted to make sure I highlighted that these are the two kind of big names, and they're going to go back and forth quite a bit during the years leading up to the Civil War and during the war itself. One of the first big clashes between these two papers was the response to John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. Some of you might be familiar with John Brown. Tried to arm slaves and lead a slave insurrection that would sweep through the South and eliminate slavery in what he believed was a much more expedient, albeit violent, way. His raid on Harper's Ferry to capture arms and ammunition and give them to former slaves was a failure. It ends up not working out. And he is hung and convicted of treason and hung. AL Post gives a very lengthy speech that was reported in both the Democrat and the Independent Republican, lengthy speech defending John Brown and his actions. Okay, this is going to be kind of the response that Southerners are going to get really fired up about. All right, they hate the idea, kind of like the opposite of what we've seen in some of these other violent issues. They hate the idea that there are people up north who are now cheering on this guy who was going to arm slaves so they can kill white Southerners. And this became a huge divisive issue. I wish I could read the whole speech for you because it's incredible, but we would be here all day long. John Brown comes up in a post-war account that I read of slave catchers actually coming to Montrose and leaving because they saw that black men were arming themselves. In this story here, they talk about these slave catchers coming to town, walking past a group of men holding a basket of revolvers, all right, to pass out to people to arm themselves to protect them from slave catchers. This account, again, post-war, so how fabricated it might be, you know, it's kind of hard to trust these sources sometimes. But the person said, that, I believe, was the last attempt that was ever made to capture a runaway slave in Old Abolition Montrose. John Brown's raid a year or two after settled the matter for all time. So after John Brown's raid, well, that's going to be the last time you're going to be hearing of slave catchers coming to Montrose. You have the build up to the election of 1860. All of these issues are going to be kind of coming to a head and clashing. And in the build up to the election, there are going to be a lot of organizations that are going to come out in support of the Republican Party and Abraham Lincoln. You're going to have a lot of the anti-slavery societies who are going to be doing this. They see that the Republican Party is the kind of clearer path towards any sort of anti-slavery legislation or change. You also have a group called the Wide Awakes. This was a group of younger, it was sort of like almost like a militant group that kind of marched through the streets. They would watch the polls to make sure that Republican voters were not getting intimidated into either not voting or voting Democratic. And they would hold these huge torchlit parades. This was also another sign for Southerners that the North was almost like mobilizing, because these wide awake groups popped up all over the North, okay, including in places like Towanda that you can see here. And one of the really scary things for Southerners was the idea that in some places, Boston being the most famous example, there were actually wide awake organizations that had black men as members. One of those places was apparently Montrose. Okay? So, again, this is a pretty interesting thing, because even within Civil War historiography, wide awakes are seen as largely white organizations, and throughout the North they mostly were. But like I said, even in little towns like here in Montrose, you had black organization and involvement in a lot of these groups, which again is something that also made Southerners not so happy. This is from the Montrose Democrat, so this is the kind of stuff that you're going to see coming out of this paper. On the eve of war, you guys might know who this guy is, Jonathan Jasper Wright. JJ Wright. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit more about him later on, but early on, again, this is something that people don't associate with Wright. He's mostly known for his career during Reconstruction and the post-war years. But early on, he spoke at a Lincoln Club in Dimmock, not too far from here, and the Democrat saw this as a sign that the Republican Party was not just a, we're trying to preserve the Union and, all that kind of stuff, but they asked, how long will it take the public to discover that Negro equality is the real mainspring of Republicanism? And Jonathan Jasper Wright's just mere presence at this meeting is making people question, this is what the Republican Party wants in the future. Okay? And his name, again, is going to pop up throughout the war. Lincoln does get elected, and he does largely through the efforts in certain places here in northeastern Pennsylvania of influential members of the Republican Party, like David Wilmot and Judge William Jessup. Wilmot, at the 1860 Republican National Convention, is actually going to be the provisional president of the entire convention when it kicks off. Judge William Jessup was the chairman of the committee that wrote the Republican Party platform in 1860. Okay, so all of this, no slavery out west, all that kind of stuff, he was the chairman of the group that put that together. Lincoln's elected, and some people are happy. But even northeastern Pennsylvania is divided. Okay? These are all results of the 1860 election in Luzerne County, which is going to include Waverly, Bradford County, which has Towanda, and then Susquehanna County, which includes Montrose. Here in Susquehanna County, Abraham Lincoln is going to get about 4,470 votes, and the Democratic ticket is going to get about 2,548. So Lincoln wins this county. Montrose was a steadfast supporter of the Republican Party, largely due to the efforts of Judge William Jessup and some of the other influential Republicans. You see the same thing in Bradford County, Towanda, okay, largely going to be going in favor of Abraham Lincoln, okay? You could probably thank David Wilmot for that. Waverly is a little bit more interesting. If you look at Waverly, 35 to 32 in favor of Abraham Lincoln. So our little village there was pretty close, right? After the talk, if anybody wants to see some of these other towns, if you're from the area or from these towns, just let me know and I'll pull them up on my laptop. So Lincoln's election is, again, he wins in this area, but you can say that there are some areas that are a little bit more divided. Montrose not being one of them. Montrose is pretty solidly behind Lincoln. George Washington Woodward is a judge from Wilkes-Barre, and he's going to be one of the leading Democratic voices throughout the wartime period. When he's talking about abolitionism, he's talking about that as kind of like the blame for all these issues. We are a church-going people, and anti-slavery has become the cherished dogma of Northern theology. We are an educating people, and abolitionism, born in hell and raised by the non-Episcopal churches, has entered into our schools, school books, and school literature. As a Northern man, I cannot in justice condemn the South for withdrawing from the Union. I wish Pennsylvania could go with them. Okay, now he's a very influential politician from this area, okay? He's going to give a speech at Independence Hall, of all places too, to give a speech like this, at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, where he says that, remember, he's talking about the growth of the country and the expansion of our power throughout the world. When you combine them in one glowing picture of national prosperity, remember that cotton, the product of slave labor, has been one of the indispensable elements of all this prosperity. More, it must be an indispensable element of all our future prosperity. So again, this is a Northeastern Pennsylvanian who's going and basically advocating pro-slavery politics. And he's again going to be a mainstay in politics in the area for throughout the war years. Now, when the war finally does break out, African American men are barred from military enlistment. There's a lot of racial prejudice that's going to play into this. You have soldiers in the Army when the debate starts about whether black men should be able to fight. You have soldiers in the Army that are basically going to say, well, we will throw down our arms and leave the military before we share a battlefield with black men. There's a lot of racial prejudice, again, that goes into this. They think that black men just cannot make capable soldiers on a battlefield. But as the war is going on, you're going to start to see the government take moves that are going to show that we are going to actively be doing something about the institution of slavery. In August 1861, the first Confiscation Act allowed for the government and the military, as they were moving through the South, to confiscate property, including slave property. Okay, so this is one step. I'm going to skip this. This is from a strength thing. We have a little bit to get through, and I want to make sure I don't spend too much time here because it's beautiful out and I want to get you guys out on your walking tour. The second Confiscation Act is going to be passed in July of 1862, so about a year after the first one, and this is going to go a step further. It not only confiscates property of those in rebellion, but talks about the slave property, saying, shall be forever free of their servitude and not again held as slaves. Now, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation kind of gets a lot of the attention when it comes to this idea of freeing slaves held in rebel territory or by those in rebellion. The Second Confiscation Act, before it became known as the Second Confiscation Act, was talked about in old newspapers as the Emancipation Bill. So this is, again, even before the Emancipation Proclamation, which does come a little bit later. With the Second Confiscation Act, you have the Militia Act. This is going to allow for the enlistment of African American men in the military, all right, for specific purposes. So essentially what Lincoln does with the Emancipation Proclamation, all right, again, David Wilmot, again, is going to advocate for the Confiscation Act. I'm going to skip that too. But this is the Emancipation Proclamation, okay? The most famous of these things. A lot of people don't know about the Confiscation Acts, okay? Now, Lincoln is basically going to take those acts and kind of roll them into one ball, and that's what the Emancipation Proclamation is, okay? It not only says, thenceforth and forever free, but it also talks about the military usage of former slaves. And at this point now, it's also freeborn African Americans. So you have northern communities now that are going to be, advocating for the sending of black soldiers off to war, and that's going to be one of the big moves in the years or the months and weeks after the issuing of the proclamation. This is from the Liberator, and you can see again how anti-slavery papers reacted to the Emancipation Proclamation. This is one of my favorite prints. This is a Union soldier. You can find this on the Library of Congress website. This is a Union soldier reading the Emancipation Proclamation to a family of enslaved people. Now, this is kind of highlighting the effect of the proclamation. A lot of people argue that the Emancipation Proclamation didn't actually free a slave. Well, as Union armies were moving through the South and they were informing families and individuals that they were actually free, not only are they freeing people, but they're also recruiting for soldiers in the military. Now, while all this is going on, the anti-slavery movement, including the Underground Railroad, is still operating, okay? Some of you might know Jermaine Logan. He's also one of the more famous names related to the Underground Railroad. He's also very closely associated with the A&E Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And he's going to operate in the Montrose area, not just through the church, but also through this Underground Railroad system. And in a letter to one of Frederick Douglass's newspapers in 1863, so just after the Emancipation Proclamation is written, he talks about, within my missionary field of labor, Binghamton and Montrose. In this letter, he's thanking people from England who are sending money over to help the anti-slavery movement. Okay, and he, again, specifically mentions Montrose. Again, this is Waverly's AME Church. I was just going to kind of get into the building up of black communities now at this point in time, but again, I want to kind of skip through this. J.J. Wright, right around the time that the debate over black enlistment in the military, he's going to get mentioned in the Montrose Democrat again. This time, it's for a meeting held to form a union league in the area. And union leagues were basically organizations for anyone who come together to say we are fully supportive of the Lincoln administration, all of the measures that the administration is putting forward, including the Emancipation Proclamation and the enlistment of black soldiers. And this area was debating forming a union league. And Jonathan Jasper Wright speaks at this. And the Democrat goes on, again, to talk about this idea that this is just proof that this is what the Republicans want. They want equality in our schools, they want equality in the government, they don't mind being lectured by a black guy, you know, look how crazy that is, okay? So again, J.J. Wright is going to be this person who's going to make an incredible name for himself in the post-war years, but early on, newspapers, including the Montrose Democrat, are going to use his existence to basically say this is what the other side is aiming towards. And again, in a very negative way.
EJ?
Yes.
I would just note that, I don't know how old he was when this was happening, but he was probably between the ages of 18 and 24, because at age 25, he was elsewhere.
Yes.
And so he was an incredible.
Young voice, yeah. And
Very
he was,
young.
And he was also a teacher, which, as a teacher, that was always a fun fact for me to learn. But he, again, is someone that, you know, local residents are going to look at and say he's been teaching, you know, he's indoctrinating people, like that kind of thing. So again, he gets a lot of attention. Now around this time, you're going to start to see recruiting take place in the north for some of these black regiments that are going to be formed and used in the war effort. Does anybody know what we're looking at here?
Boston.
So Boston, you know what we're looking at?
54th.
Monument to the 54th Massachusetts Infantry.
Okay.
This is going to be the first
Come and see.
northeastern regiment that's going to be accepted by the government. It's going to become very famous for their exploits, particularly at Fort Wagner in South Carolina. The 54th, again, not just gets attention during wartime, but becomes very famous. I'm sure most of us here have probably seen the movie Glory, okay, about the 54th Massachusetts. This is, again, a story that people tend to think, okay, it's the 54th Massachusetts, Boston, abolitionists, all that kind of stuff. One thing that I love to tell people, and this is a fact that blew my mind when I first read this, is that the state that is actually most represented in the 54th Massachusetts is the state of Pennsylvania. In Waverly, and Douglas is going to actually come to Pennsylvania, not to, at least as far as we know, not to northeastern Pennsylvania, but he does come to Pennsylvania, specifically Philadelphia, to recruit for the 54th Massachusetts. He mentions John Brown in a speech that he gives, so you can kind of talk about, you know, the motivation that he's trying to use to get people to enlist. But you're going to see that Montrose is actually going to get the attention of the Philadelphia Inquirer, because a soldier had just come from Massachusetts and brought men who were recruited from here in Montrose to go and enlist in the 54th Massachusetts. Now, this article and a couple articles that I found highlight the fact that there was 20-some odd men from Montrose who went to enlist. The records that I have found show that there was about 14 who actually made it into the regiment, because you could be denied enlistment for a various number of reasons. So this was a little bit more of an optimistic look at Montrose's sending to recruit for the 54th Massachusetts, but the Montrose Democrat had a little bit more of a negative take. A squad of 24, and you could probably imagine the word that's behind that little censoring block there, but a squad of 24 expletive left this village on Thursday last to join Governor Andrews' Black Regiment. So the Montrose Democrat was not so thrilled at this large contingent of men who are going to go off and join this regiment. Barrington Waverly is a member of the 54th Massachusetts. A guy named Samuel Thomas, who we know that kind of in the post-war years made his way between Waverly and Binghamton. So we do get to highlight the 54th as part of our tour. And this is from the National Park Service. This was the website where I kind of stumbled upon the idea that you had the 14 men who were officially actually enlisted in the 54th. I would like to do a project if I can try to find out about the men who maybe were not enlisted, got denied for whatever reason they may have gotten denied for. But yeah, this is from the National Park Service website, and it's a very, very useful source. All of these are little dots where members of the 54th were recruited. So this map shows the whole United States, but obviously in the north you're going to see a lot of different bubbles pop up, and one of those bubbles is right here in Montrose. Buried in Montrose Cemetery, a couple members of the 54th, including Benjamin Naylor. I'm not going to get too much into his background, but again, just like Waverly, you're going to see a lot of representation in this very famous regiment that people don't typically associate with northeastern Pennsylvania. I always tell people after I talk about the 54th, I say, now when you go and watch Glory, you can think of it with a little bit more of a different perspective on who you're looking at in terms of the soldiers who are fighting. Harriet Tubman's going to come in close contact with the 54th in South Carolina, where they're going to be stationed. She's going to actually act as a nurse, and she's going to nurse some of the members of the 54th after her famous raid in the Columbia River. And again, I mentioned Glory, so I had to throw the movie poster in there. Now, when you are being recruited, the 54th is going to be recruited out of Massachusetts, but most of the Pennsylvanians who are going to fight in black regiments are going to be enlisted in Philadelphia. So if you want to enlist in one of these USCT or United States Colored Troops regiments, you would have to make a long journey down to Philadelphia. You would have to go to the recruiting office to get approved for enlistment. That was in Center City, not close, or not too far from Independence Hall today. And then you would get sent outside of the city to Camp William Penn, where you would train. And this is a picture of a United States Colored Troops regiment training at Camp William Penn. One of the regiments that's going to go off to war is the 3rd USCT. And one of the things that's very interesting about these United States Colored Troops regiments is they got these very unique and very beautifully designed flags, regimental flags, to take out onto the battlefield with them. So when you are fighting against Confederates, this is the image that you are choosing to bring on a battlefield with you. The 3rd USCT rather die free men than live to be slaves. So quite a message that you're sending to your enemy there. The 3rd is going to be a regiment that does have ties to both Waverly and Montrose. The Norris family, Lot Norris was one of the first formerly enslaved residents of Waverly to actually come and settle in the town. He becomes a preacher in Waverly's AME Church, and he has 2 sons, Peter and Joshua Norris, who are going to join the 3rd USCT, and they're going to march off to war. John Sampson, buried in Waverly. Peter Norris is buried right here in Montrose Cemetery because he actually moves to Montrose in the post-war years. John Sampson is buried in Waverly. He was freeborn in Binghamton, New York, also going to join the 3rd USCT. And what happens when you embark for war is that there's usually like this grand parade right through Center City, Philadelphia. You march right past Independence Hall. You're carrying that regimental flag. The 3rd USCT went off to war singing John Brown's body lies moldering in the grave. So John Brown's body, very famous marching song, this unit is going to march off to war. Think of the symbolism of that, marching past Independence Hall, waving that flag, singing John Brown's body, okay? Talk about a change, right? In society and culture and everything that's going on in the United States, these parades are going to be a symbol of that change. Speaking of Independence Hall, there it is. And if you think it looks familiar, that's because our Waverly Community House was modeled after Independence Hall. So I always have to make that point. Now, just to highlight again this idea that as these units, and it's not just white units, but as black units are going to be moving through the South, they are going to be acting as liberators. And this is a letter from a Thomas Rockhold, who was not only just a member of the 3rd, but was a member of the same company that Peter Norris and John Sampson were a part of. So this account was something that they were directly involved in. They were supposed to raid a rebel encampment, and they said, we got to the rebel camp about 1 o'clock at night, but we're too late to do any good. But we had the pleasure of liberating some of our flesh and blood. There were about 200 slaves at that place that had the pleasure of saying, we are free from the chains and fetters of slavery. So again, this is a powerful account of something that northeastern Pennsylvania played an active role in. Okay, again, something that we don't typically think about when we think about the story of emancipation are black residents of the area going and, again, being liberators in the Army. This was printed in the Christian Reporter, which was the AME Church's official newspaper, official publication out of Philadelphia. Represented from Montrose was the 6th United States Colored Troops. David Nelson, who was freeborn in upstate New York. He actually worked as a porter in the fire company here in Montrose in the pre-war years. But David Nelson is not only going to enlist when the government allows for African American enlistment, and you can see his enlistment papers here. He's born in Ithaca. But he's also going to be an active participant in the Underground Railroad here in Montrose. And he lives through the war, and in his post-war years, he eventually moves to Scranton. And in Scranton, he becomes a very visible member of the community. And upon his death, he got a lot of laurels in local newspapers, in his obituaries. And they highlight, again, his involvement in the Underground Railroad station here in Montrose. In Waverly, the center of our story is the story of George Keyes, the first formerly enslaved resident to actually settle in our small town, and people like Rodman Sisson, who actually actively assisted George Keyes in evading slave catchers. Keyes is going to enlist in the 22nd USCT, and that regiment is kind of the center of our program, because just from Waverly alone, there were 6 men who enlisted in the 22nd USCT. Some of them formerly enslaved, some freeborn here in northeastern Pennsylvania. The 22nd gets a lot of attention because during the kind of latter parts of the war, they're going to be involved in the campaign to try to take the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, which eventually is successful. But there's a town just south of Petersburg that were also part of this big campaign. And during the initial attacks on Petersburg, the 22nd USCT was one of the only U.S. Army regiments to actually successfully capture Confederate positions. They got a lot of attention because of this. This is Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. So, like, if you were mentioned in Frank Leslie's back then, you were a big deal, right? So you can see here, this is members of the 22nd hauling off captured Confederate artillery. And in the background, there's a unit of white soldiers actively cheering them on. So this is a nice kind of illustration of the change that is taking place in the military when it comes to the thought of African American soldiers. This is going to be kind of a precursor to a change in thought as to citizenship and civil rights and, you know, the place of African Americans in society. Has anyone here ever been to West Point, U.S. Military Academy? So if you've ever been, you may have seen this. This is a painting done by a French artist in the post-war years, 1870s, of the 22nd charging the Confederate works outside of Petersburg. This painting still hangs in the West Point Museum to this day. So when I say the 22nd got a lot of attention, they got quite a bit of attention. Talk about battle flags. This was the battle flag that the 22nd USCT took onto the battlefield with them. Again, think about that. Regiment of both freeborn and formerly enslaved men, some of them who are going back to the areas of Virginia that they were actually held in bondage, and this is the image that you are bringing onto the battlefield with you. A black soldier at the point of bayonet. There's some debate as to what's going on here, whether he's actually killing him or just forcing his surrender. But this is a pretty drastic image. I mean, you can imagine the response to maybe if you're a Confederate soldier and you see this image on the battlefield with you. I also like to talk about the phrase here. Sic semper tyrannis. Anybody recognize that phrase? So, thus be it to tyrants, or death to tyrants is a couple different variations of it. This is, to this day, and has been for a very, very long time, the motto of the Commonwealth of Virginia. It's also what John Wilkes Booth yells after he shoots Abraham Lincoln in the back of the head at Ford's Theater and jumps off the stage and escapes. He yells, "Sic semper tyrannis." So this is for me as a teacher especially, you think about interpretation, right? Who do you think the 22nd thought the tyrants were? Well, probably these guys, I would imagine. Who do you think John Wilkes Booth thought the tyrant was? Abraham Lincoln, right? So, and the state of Virginia's motto gets its origins in opposition to the King of England. So again, you can see how this phrase has been, used over time. Now, the attack on Petersburg comes in 1864, and this is right around when people are starting to realize that the war, if this war goes how it looks like it's going to go now, there's going to be drastic change. Excuse me. In October of 1864, there is going to be held the National Convention of Colored Men in Syracuse, New York. And at this convention, there is going to be local representation for men who are politically going to be involved in the discussions. You can see J.J. Wright, right here. Pittston's James Davinger. Solomon Cooper of Towanda, also a reverend in the AME Church. So again, you can see that we're, the story, these large things that are happening that typically you don't associate with northeastern Pennsylvania history, we have a direct hand in a lot of these major events that are taking place. In 1864, Abraham Lincoln is also running for re-election. People tend to forget about this, that while the war was going on, he actively had to campaign and run to get re-elected. He sends out Republicans to canvass different areas, and northeastern Pennsylvania is, the northern tier at least, is going to be one of the targeted areas for some of the people who are going to go out and campaign for Lincoln. This is a letter that I found on the Library of Congress website by John Forney, one of the kind of leading anti-slavery Republicans. And he's writing from Montrose, Susquehanna County in 1864, and he's very happy at what he's seeing. I feel very much encouraged at all the manifestations which have greeted me along the route, and from everything I hear, we shall largely increase our vote in November and add to your majorities in all Union counties. Our friends are mortified that they should have fallen off in any quarter in October, but are resolved to make up their deficiencies in November. And he's writing just after having met with people in Montrose. So Montrose, probably made it seem like things were going to go the way they want in this election. One of the other travelers had a little bit of a different opinion. This is Thomas Fitzgerald, who was also going to be sent by Lincoln. He's writing from Tioga County. And he says, so far as this northern tier of counties is concerned, our entire canvass has been mismanaged. So he's got a little bit of a more negative take. But Lincoln does win in 1864. However, this area was a little complicated for Lincoln. I was not able to find the official Susquehanna County vote in the presidential election. So this is the governor campaign and the congressional campaigns in 1864, so right before the presidential election, to give you an idea of how the presidential election probably would have went. The Republican is going to get 3,318 votes, and the Democrat 2,514. So Montrose, or Susquehanna County, stays pretty solidly in the Republican camp. Montrose, again, Republican, very large Republican majority. So Montrose does not waver. And again, you can kind of probably thank people like Judge William Jessup. Same thing with Bradford County, 6,199 votes for Lincoln, 2,818 for the Democrat George McClellan. So Bradford County, Towanda, pretty solid. Missouri County is a different story. Lincoln, 6,646 votes. The Democrats, 9,541. So Luzerne County actually flips heavily against Lincoln in 1864. Waverly, 29 to 28 against Abraham Lincoln. So imagine being a Republican who slept in that day and didn't make it out to the polls. So again, you can see that this area, while some of them were steadfastly Republican, northeastern Pennsylvania in some areas, a little more complicated. But eventually Lincoln does win re-election. Eventually Richmond falls. Eventually the end of the war comes about. But you also have the passage of the 13th Amendment. Bradford County's J.H. March, Joseph March, is going to go and speak at the state senate, basically talking about, this is something that has been long overdue. He talks about it as slavery, a great moral and societal evil, and a great weight hung about the neck of our nation. And he's finally to see that weight being kind of taken off. There was, to the Montrose Independent Republican, a reporter, a correspondent who was actually in the House of Representatives when the passage of the 13th Amendment was announced. Okay, and he's going to write back to the paper about his experience. Now, this is a pretty incredible account. If the fossils who believe the world does not move had been with me in the hall of the House of Representatives on the 31st, they would have been astonished. For I believe I was witness to one of these memorable scenes which showed that human progress cannot be checked. So again, this is a huge moment, momentous occasion for the United States, and the Montrose Independent Republican had a correspondent who happened to be there. I thought that was pretty cool. In the post-war years, again, the discussion over civil rights for African Americans is going to be initiated, especially by United States colored troops veterans who are going to use their military service as kind of a catalyst towards full civil rights. The state's Equal Rights Convention is going to kind of echo the national convention that was held in Syracuse. This is going to be held in Harrisburg in February of 1865. J.J. Wright, active voice at this convention. And the first thing that he brings up is the idea of the right of franchise. And he actually talks about the 1838 constitutional change that took place in our country, or in our state, that actually stripped black men of the right to vote. So again, very active voice in the civil rights movement during the Civil War.
What does mean? What does that mean?
Right of franchise, the right to vote.
Right to vote.
Yep.
Thanks.
Two local guys, and again, just a brief mention, Woodward, who I mentioned before, Andrew Bedford, whose home stands in Waverly. These guys were two people who in 1838 at this convention actively support the idea of inserting the word white. So again, you can see that there was opposition to a lot of the civil rights change that was occurring. Now, as I said, eventually Richmond falls, eventually the war is over, Robert E. Lee surrenders, and everything's all great, right? Not so much. Richmond, however, when Richmond does fall, USCT regiments, including the 22nd, are going to be some of the first units to enter the Confederate capital. So think about, again, the symbolism of that and the meaning of that. You also have the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. So there is like a flurry of events. It's almost like looking into a kaleidoscope as all these things are changing, all these events are taking place, and how people are reacting to them. Upon Lincoln's assassination, the 22nd is going to be hand-selected by a general in the military because of their wartime service to participate in Lincoln's funeral procession through Washington, D.C. Okay, so this unit, again, one of the reasons why we highlight them so much as a part of our program is because they were kind of there for a lot of the central events at the end of the war. Upon the return of soldiers, a local resident of Hot Bottom is going to write to the Montrose Independent Republican to welcome soldiers back home. Okay, this is just soldiers overall, no particular soldiers. But this letter says, "You have bravely endured all to save our country. The ensign of liberty today not only claims the perpetuation of a free government, but freedom to a race, bidding defiance to traitors." So you can see how kind of Northerners saw this war. You know, what was it all about and what is going to come of it, right? This is a little bit of a highlight of that. You also did have the return of USCT veterans. Harrisburg is going to host a grand parade of USCT soldiers returning from the war front in November of 1865. And again, the theme of the day, there are speeches given, there are resolutions read. The theme of the day, the elective franchise, the right to vote. Okay, and again, they're going to use this military service idea as we fought for this country, we fought under the flag of this country, we saved the flag of this country, we deserve the full civil rights that this country has to offer. Then you have the debate of, what about former Confederates? If you give them the right to, because that was a big debate too, if you give them the right to vote, you better give us the right to vote, right? So this is going to be one of the main kind of talking points until the passage of the post-Civil War amendments to the Constitution, particularly the 15th that guarantees the right to vote. In 1865, Montrose also saw its own return parade of USCT soldiers. This is also in the collection of the Historical Society here. This is my all-time favorite wartime picture from the Civil War. And this is members of the 54th Massachusetts and a couple other USCT regiments, including the 6th. There is a list of men who can be identified as having known to have been in this parade. David Nelson, who I showed you before, is one of them. So he's in that procession somewhere. One of the things that I find fascinating about this photo is that you guys know what this street looks like today. Pretty much like this, right? I find that to be fascinating. I love that. Okay? And that's one of the things I really like about Montrose and Waverly is that when you walk around these towns, you're getting a sense of what the town looked like during this time period, and that's why this photo always fascinates me.
Minus the horses.
Minus the horses, yeah. You know, you can add a couple things, you know, a nicely paved road, there, but for the most part, it's looking pretty much the same. Now, Jonathan Jasper Wright, post-war, is going to become a very important figure in the Reconstruction movement. He becomes the first black man admitted to the Pennsylvania bar, the first black lawyer in Pennsylvania. The Montrose Democrat, not so thrilled about that, seeing that as the modern radical doctrine of equality, the fact that J.J. Wright was even admitted to the bar. J.J. Wright, though, I love this guy because he was not going to let anyone mess with him or push him around. He's actively going to write to the Montrose Democrat whenever they bring up his name and they get something wrong or they think that they presented him as something that he's not. He made sure to write to the paper and told them, you better print what I'm telling you. At one point, they say that he was practicing law in Norfolk, Virginia. He got really upset about that because he wanted people to know that he was practicing law in the cradle of secession, South Carolina, and wrote to the Democratic paper saying, I want you to put this correction in so people know where it is that I'm doing what I'm doing right now. Okay, and this is in June 1865, right after he first goes down south as a member to help educate the formerly enslaved and USCT soldiers who are stationed in South Carolina. Later on, the Democrat mentions that Jonathan Jasper Wright, late of South Carolina. He got really upset about this, okay, because he wanted it to be known that it was known. Luzerne and moved to Susquehanna County, Pennsylvania, okay? He wanted to make sure that people knew where he came from, okay? And that people knew that his sentiment, the ideas that he had, they weren't born in South Carolina, they were born in northeastern Pennsylvania. I thought this was a really interesting one too, and this is from August of 1866, so about a year after the war is over. I'm going to skip, but this is all just about kind of J.J. Wright, and this is where I'm going to end, okay? We looked at that picture, right, the courthouse, these returning soldiers. Well, right before J.J. Wright is going to go to South Carolina to begin his Reconstruction career, he gives what I think is one of the most important speeches that I've read from anyone who has spoken in northeastern Pennsylvania, particularly places like Montrose or Waverly. He's going to give a speech about what the war meant and what the future might bring. This is an advertisement from the Independent Republican who compare J.J. Wright to Frederick Douglass. He is pronounced by good judges to be equal to Fred Douglass, though unlike him, he has no white blood in his veins. Well, that's an interesting thing to bring up when you're talking about Frederick Douglass and trying to compare him to J.J. Wright, but high praise as a speaker. And he is going to, on April 3rd, this is the same day that Richmond falls. So the same day that the 22nd USCT is marching into the Confederate capital, J.J. Wright is talking about the meaning of the war. So I'm going to leave on a couple of his quotes from this speech, and hopefully that will serve as inspiration as you're walking around and checking out the sites around town. He's speaking to a large crowd of both black residents of the town and white residents. So some of the things he's going to say is not just going to be this uplifting, the war's over, we won. It's also going to be kind of like a ridicule of how people approach the issues surrounding the war. He starts off, even when treason had flaunted its banner full in your faces, when your flag had been insulted and your capital was menaced by an armed foe, even then there might have been found among you those who would have given them whatever they asked, even to the nation's death, that the pride of the South might be gratified. So he's basically looking at a lot of the white residents saying, this was your fault, because you allowed it to happen. Okay? You wanted to appease the South over all these compromises over time, the slavery issue, the discussions back and forth. You compromised, and now here we are. That's essentially what he's saying here. He then gets into the service of black men in the war effort. He says, on the bloody fields of Port Hudson and Olustee, two battles that saw action from USCT and regiments like the 54th Massachusetts, he mingled his blood with that of the white man. The slave is tracking his way in blood from the deep abyss of slavery to where he can stand in the broad sunlight of freedom. God heard the cry of the oppressed and downtrodden, and he is working out their redemption in his own good time and manner. The cloud of despair that has so long chained the mind and body of the slave is breaking, and the heavens betoke a glorious dawning. Now that's a little bit more of an optimistic view of the future, right? But then he gets into some of the people or the ideas that might be kind of opposed as you move forward. And this is kind of what he ends on. This is what we're going to kind of end on here as well. Today, 200,000 black men follow the stars and stripes and battle in the ranks. For what? For the Union as it was? The Union was the price of slavery in the slave trade, and for 80 years slavery has been protected by it. Is it for the Constitution as it was? That Constitution doomed the black man to perpetual bondage. No, they are fighting for their own freedom, for the right to protect their own wives and children. The compromise I would give them would be the Union as it ought to be, free from the lakes to the Gulf and from ocean to ocean, and the Constitution as it is with the last amendment, the 13th Amendment, with the Emancipation Proclamation thrown in. So now he's looking at these discussions that are being had, political discussions about civil rights, things like that, and saying, no more compromises. Okay? We know what came of this war, we know what caused it, and we know what needs to be fixed as a result of it. Now obviously, when we look at Reconstruction, very, very complicated. J.J. Wright's going to stay in South Carolina. He's going to become South Carolina State Senator, South Carolina State Supreme Court. South Carolina in 1868 is reforming their state constitution. He's going to have a large hand in forming the judicial aspects of it, some of which are still in play to this day. So this was what the future was supposed to look like, according to Jonathan Jasper Wright. And obviously, as we know, the future was much more complicated. In a lot of ways, we're kind of still figuring it out. But that is the story of Montrose in northeastern Pennsylvania when it comes to the anti-slavery movement, the Underground Railroad, and I hope I was able to bring some new information to many of you who I know very much know this story already. So thank you so much for coming in today. All right. This is what I wanted to end on because it's one of those things like the more things change, the more they stay the same. So this was my end piece. Montrose as it was then, Montrose as it is today.
Meters.
I'd just like to mention that, that speech in 1865, Jonathan Jasper Wright was only 25 years old.
So yeah, so you're, again, you know, he's very young, he's going off, think of that, 25 years old, just a couple years later, going to be involved in all these major things. So yeah, this was a man, and you can kind of tell in some of his speeches and his writings, he was definitely trying to prove himself, and he ended up doing a pretty good job.
Well,
So.
Cindy, you told me something that was interesting, that he was teaching in the South just at the time, that, I mean, the war was not over, correct?
Oh, well, he went to Beaufort, South Carolina,
Yeah.
right. And-
Yeah, it was, so the speech that he gave, again, April 3rd, the day that Richmond falls, he's giving that right on the eve of going off down south, so.
You've got to be a very brave person to,
Yeah, and you're gonna see, again, Reconstruction years, a lot of post-war violence, especially racially motivated violence in the South. So yeah, you were, by making that jump and going down, you were sure, trying to help and improve and things like that, but you were risking a lot. And fortunately, he became a voice that people listen to.
Excuse me.
Yes.
For those of you who are aware and not aware, when I was in college in Washington, D.C. at Howard University, one of the teachers asked who comes from the northeastern part of Pennsylvania. Well, I said, well, I come from Susquehanna County. He said, do you know who Jonathan Jasper Wright is? I said, no. He said, you should be ashamed of yourself. No, you should. He told all the class, and I said, when I get back home, I'm going to find out who this guy, Jonathan Jasper Wright, especially coming from Springfield. And that motivated us and us to start. And that's why we got the historical marker in Springfield. Because he kicked my ass.
And that's actually really, I'm really glad you made that point because that was something, when I started kind of getting involved with our project here, I'm a teacher in Scranton. So one of the things that I was able to look at this from was from an education perspective. Because I kind of asked that question now too, because again, I didn't know, before I got involved with this program, I knew nothing about Jonathan Jasper Wright. The more I learned about him, the more I thought about the education. I went to Abington Heights, so I'm not too far from here. You would think Jonathan Jasper Wright would be someone that you might have heard about. And I actually started to call around to teacher friends of mine to ask, you ever hear this guy? No. Now, to go even farther, not even just a singular individual, but the idea of the Underground Railroad in this area. The anti-slavery movement, all the politics, the stories of the individuals, all that stuff that I talked about today, it's part of my school curriculum because I happen to be lucky enough to do this, but this is not a widely told in the education system here in northeastern Pennsylvania, and not to any fault of the schools or whatever. This is just something that a lot of people just don't know about. So one of the things that we are very proud about as a part of our program is trying to reach out to schools and get field trips and educational programs, things like that. So that way, we don't have any teacher shortage. But yeah, so before we kind of wrap things up here, and you guys are going on your walking tour again, beautiful day outside. Could not ask for a better day. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, please.
The Waverly Community Center then gives you more information about the Underground Railroad and maybe the house.
Yes, so we, as part of our program, we offer a guided walking tour. What we do, we kind of walk around the town, kind of just about what you're going to do today. We highlight some of the homes. We go to a couple cemeteries where formerly enslaved residents are buried. And then we kind of highlight, just like we did today, we talk about the politics of the area, all that kind of stuff. So it's essentially what we did today, just more centered on Waverly than as opposed to Montrose.
What was the preferred route for slaves coming to Montrose? I mean, there wasn't Route 11 at that time, but how did they get?
So you had, some people would follow the Susquehanna River. You had some people who would There were old Native American paths that actually ended up turning into some of our major roadways that are still used today. South Abington Road, which runs right in front of the Waverly Community House, that was called the Warriors Path at one time. So you have these old Native American paths that are used, and then you have this, the stories of people kind of running through the woods, things like that. You have some of that, but you also just have like nighttime excursions. You would have people from Wilkes Barre who would use their horses and wagons, hide people in the back, transport people from one town to the next. So there wasn't really like one specific, this is the way you have to go. It was, these are the options, and that's the thing about the Underground Railroad is it wasn't as organized and a strictly connected system like a lot of people think that it was. It was a lot of times you're going on a wing of prayer from one place to the next. I'm hoping that you got the right information, hoping that you knock on the right person's door, right? So yeah, it's and like I said, that adds to the difficulty of being able to tell the story with like 100% accuracy. That's why in Waverly, we only highlight as people who were active participants in the Underground Railroad. There are only two Waverly residents that we can actually say we saw enough documentation over time that we can say that they were actually participants.
But when you look at the proximity to the fact that there is no water here, or even in Waverly, I mean, that was a big deal for them to come this far.
Yeah, and typically you're talking like maybe a stay for a day or two, you get a meal, maybe some rest, and then you're on somewhere else, which also kind of adds to the bold decision for some people to stay in these towns, right? Again, we talked about before, slave catchers coming to Montrose, slave catchers coming to Waverly. In that letter that's in the collection here, they mention the black residents of Waverly going to work with pistols that were loaded because they were genuinely afraid that there might be slave catchers coming. So again, these are these big natural stories that everyone kind of has heard about, but we like to try to make it a little bit more localized so you get a different perspective on it. So.
Questions about the Underground Railroad are some of the maybe two or three questions that we get. And we disappoint people by saying, we don't know.
Yeah.
Because it was a secret. Some folks are chagrined to find out that it wasn't literally underground here. And that there is no notice that there's a tunnel from the post house to the courthouse. That the grates in the street up there were not, in front of a house, are not the way into someone's home.
Yeah.
Because that would be the best idea for an enslaved person escaping, to try to get into someone's house in the front of their house. Great idea, not a great idea.
Yeah, there we get guests who are maybe not so familiar with the story of the Underground Railroad, and some of the first questions that I'll get is, so when do we get on the train? And when do we go underground? And I'm like, maybe you're thinking of the coal mine tour.
Which is not
It
just
doesn't just come from children, it comes from adults.
No, yes, exactly, yeah. Usually adults, actually.
There is a train from Alford into Montrose.
Right.
Now,
Not till later.
Not till later, but, is he moving there? We don't know. We also have some other weird things that we know. I know that Enoch Walker, who lived in Dimmock, who moved there in 1820, was a conductor on the Underground Railroad down in Chester County. And he was a Quaker. And in 1830, he and Joseph Baker, another Quaker, both had free black people living in their households. We're right on 29. Was Route 29 away from Tunkhannock, the river up through? I'm putting words in somebody's mouth. The thing is, who were these people? I don't know. I have no evidence that Enoch Walker was still doing this. He's kind of getting to be an older man, but who was it? And we have clues, but not enough. So we disappoint a lot of people by telling them we don't know either. So
yeah, we have to say maybe a lot when guests come, especially ones who are from the Waverly area, who say, well, I heard this story about this one house when I was growing up, and I can say, sure, maybe, until I come across an account that tells me that this house or these people were involved, then sure, maybe. They could be.
And Montrose has a secret door.
Yeah, everything, yeah.
And it's like, well, people didn't have closets much then. Maybe
I was going to say
one of
storage
those
space
these
was
houses that, who knows what, it was just big enough.
Well, it tunneled back into an area over the kitchen.
Oh,
So
okay,
where the warmth from the kitchen came up. That was-
yeah.
That's the story.
That's the story, yeah.
But anyway, does anyone else have any questions?
Did they ever make a direct connection between the Dennis Farm and the Underground Railroad, or?
So the Dennis Farm is actually something I have been meaning to reach out and talk to the people who run that organization for a very long time. I have not been able to do that, and I have not done much research about the Dennis Farm, so I can't directly answer that. Again, it's one of those, maybe, but I don't know enough to be able to
That's
talk to
something
speak
to
to
say.
that.
Yes, I didn't hear the question.
The Dennis Farm, any direct connection to the Underground Railroad?
According to Denise, they did have connections, and according to her, they had buried some people who were on the Underground Railroad in their cemetery. I don't know what kind of written documentation they might have.
Yeah.
And a lot of the grave sites at their cemetery are just fieldstones, no names.
We did every year we have a journal, and this year I did an article on a man, but we'll talk about him, Mr. Edwards? Yeah.
Yes.
But there was a bit in his obituary that said, thanks to the white people of Montrose, he grew up to be a great man, blah, 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 blah. And I'm thinking, he probably wasn't living among all the white people in Montrose. And give the man some credit for being what he is, but, we have to also look at the black community as being the movers and shakers in the Underground Railroad.
Yeah, and that's one thing, if you come and take our tour, we kind of get into more detail about that and how the community actively helped each other. It wasn't just, these white folks who were sympathizing, who were part of the story. It was the black community in all these towns that actually kind of served as the kind of the main hub.
Because
So,
where else are you going, where would be a good place to hide?
yeah.
Among people that look like you.
I didn't realize it, and she just found it on the Google or whatever she looked at. But I've always wondered, why African Road, behind the Weiss Market in Vestal? Why is that called African Road? Because the first African American family.
I can tell you a little bit about that, and it is a guess. But Dr. Rose, who, his bank, we will visit this afternoon if we get that far, also was involved with those who came north from Philadelphia as fugitives, because he was from Philadelphia, so he had some connections. He started a black farming community at the Silver Lake, his Silver Lake home, between 1830 and 1840. So they are not in the census. But he wrote to William Jessup here in town about his farming community problems, and I will speak about that later. In about 1838, that black community, I think there were 9 families, left Silver Lake and went to Binghamton. So it may have been that they settled on that road that became known as African Road. I don't know for sure, but
Because
it's
it
a guess.
ends right at a farmhouse. And I always wondered, why does this road just like stop at this farmhouse? Why did it go African Road?
Do you have any other questions for EJ?
And thank you everyone so much for coming out today. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.